If you have watched the last episode and you can identify yourself with an anxious attachment style, today I have very good news for you, because there are definitely ways to work through and heal the wounds of an anxious attachment style. And therefore today I would like to share 5 possible approaches here with you. Let's get started right away. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert, and this video is based on my own experience, my research and therapy work, because I'm not a healthcare professional myself, and instead I share a client's perspective here on this channel. And for everyone who is looking for more in-depth resources for working through complex trauma, I also share the most significant learnings and practical exercises from years of therapy in our premium community, and you can get access to that community at understandable.net/join. This video today is video number 4 of a 4-part double series on attachment styles. So I made 8 videos, 2 on each attachment style. Again, today's number 4. And in the first 2 episodes, we already talked about 10 signs that you might have an avoidant attachment style and how to cope with that style. In the second double episode, so in the last episode and in today's episode, we already talked about 10 signs of an anxious attachment style, and today, this is episode number 4, we talk about how to manage that one. And in the next 2 episodes, so double episode number 3, we will then talk about 10 signs of a fearful avoidant / disorganized attachment style, and afterwards we also talk about solutions and approaches for that style. And in the last 2 episodes, we are talking about all the lucky ones who might have a secure attachment style and how a securely attached person can help us insecurely attached people to heal. And to get a broader overview of all the 4 attachment styles, I also recommend you watching our episode on complex trauma and the 4 attachment styles, and I will link all the episodes in the description below every episode of the series, and you also find them in the attachment style playlist here on the YouTube channel. If you saw my video about healing an avoidant attachment style, you already know why I don't put couples counseling here on this list. And in case you didn't watch that video, here's a quick disclaimer, because this also applies to the anxious attachment style. Now, conventional therapy like couples counseling is, as far as I can see, not a favorable approach for working through anxious attachment patterns. Now, why do I think that? Well, in couples counseling, some therapists might encourage the anxiously attached partner to give the avoidant one more space and holding back, which is, by the way, a typical symptom of the avoidant attachment style. And at the same time, the avoidant partner is encouraged to give the anxiously attached counterpart more attention and care, which they request so often as out of their anxiously attached wounds. This adaptation leads for both parts to trigger each other less, which sounds good at first, but neither of them actually does any healing or resolving here. And that's a problem. And this is because this approach tries to solve things on a behavioral level and not on a depth psychological level. And this is why I researched some other approaches for you today that I found more appealing for working especially through anxious attachment wounds. Now let's start with number 1 here. And approach number 1 is reparenting the anxious inner child. Again, quickly summarize what is inner child's work. Inner child's work goes back to the work of Carl Gustav Jung's concept of the child's archetype, but it's also a concept in the work of Eric Berne, for example, and John Bradshaw, and it also appears in attachment theory and developmental psychology. Especially Bradshaw emphasizes how childhood trauma, attachment wounds, and unmet emotional needs can manifest as dysfunctional behaviors in adulthood, and to reparent a preoccupied, anxiously attached child, we have to understand the anxiously attached child first. Now, when a child's needs for consistent love, safety, and reassurance weren't met in the early years, they then develop an anxious attachment style, as you may have learned in the previous video already. And your task as an adult now is to identify and fulfill those unmet needs internally rather than seeking external validation from your partners, because this is what we as anxiously attached people would usually do. And this then allows you to more and more become your own source of comfort and stability instead of seeking that from the outside, from your partners, which then will reduce your dependency on others for emotional regulation. And I want to give you a few practical steps here as followed. Number one, in reparenting the anxious inner child, is to recognize your triggers. And this is the very first step in, I call, stopping to recall your own bullshit. Your BS, okay? Now, what you do here is you identify all the situations that activate feelings of fear, of insecurity, or abandonment in your relationships. If you identify those, then you have a conscious awareness of those. These triggers, simply spoken, often reflect the inner child's unresolved fear of being unloved or abandoned. Number two, after you identify those, after that, try to build self-compassion. I know that this one is a difficult one. Practice speaking to your inner child with compassion and reassurance. You are okay and you are worthy just as you are. This helps to replace the self-critical or the anxious internal dialogue that you might have so often here. And it's of course often the case that we wished for compassion, especially from our caregivers, and we maybe also regret our childhood a bit. But at the time, we are not able to encounter ourselves with compassion and love, so we can do that now. Number three is, what you can also do in that process is visiting old childhood memories. So what you do here is you gently explore early experiences where love and connection, for example, felt inconsistent. But also, I always like that a lot because, well, usually this approach focuses on the negative experiences and memories. But what I love a lot is to also identify situations where things were going great and where you felt a connection to yourself and to your caregivers, where things have been good. And there were always times, I guess, for everyone, at least hours, maybe minutes, where things were going good and where there was harmony consistent. Also revisit those memories. And if you like, write those things down using the journal. Number four is to develop and establish a secure base after doing the other steps. Now, through inner child's work, you can establish an internal secure base where you feel safe and where you feel self-sufficient, even in the absence of external reassurance. If you do so, this reduces your tendency to overcling to romantic partners for security through that inner child work. Let's continue with approach number two, bringing reality into fantasy. As anxiously attached people, we often tend to cling to fantasies. And we do that when being in a relationship. We also do that when we are single. So it's usually a pretty strong indicator, as I explained, for example, in this episode, where we talked about how anxiously attached people use fantasies to self-regulate. And when we learn to self-regulate through fantasies, we use this strategy as a way to cope with our insecure attachment and especially with our caregiver relationships as children. We escape kind of into fantasies. We quit reality and imagine things, constellations, for example, getting adopted also from someone as children who maybe have a better family life, who have secure relationships, or we also tend to imagine that there are celebrities, for example, who marry us, who start a relationship with us because we project this need for safety, love, and stability on those people that we, for example, see online, or that we think we could have a better relationship and life with. And in order to work through that anxious attachment, you have to bring reality into exactly those fantasies. Or in other words, you can take off those fantasy glasses here. And a disclaimer up front, if you have escaped many times in fantasies to self-regulate, this can definitely disrupt a lot of things in your life. And this is because you, of course, then take away a huge option for self-regulation for yourself here. Now, when you do so, you can self-reflect on your feelings that you have in a specific situation. For example, do the feelings for a partner that you have stem from genuine connection or idealized expectations and high hopes? Example, let's say you go on a first date and an anxiously attached person here might feel euphoric simply because the other person they are seeing responded positively to a text. Maybe after that date, you have seen that person and they text back, "Hey, it was good, it was great, it was nice to see you." And you think, "Oh my gosh, that's so amazing, it gives you such a good feeling." But in reality, this response doesn't guarantee, first of all, a deep compatibility with you and that other person, and also does not say anything about if the other person actually truly likes you or even wants a connection with you. So it can be an indicator, of course, but in reality, after the first date, is not usually the case. To resolve that, you can ask yourself, well, what would a neutral observer see in this situation? Doing so, this separates the facts of what's actually happening, for example, two people enjoying a walk together, from over-interpretation or building future fantasies with that person. You might also challenge your inner child's projections here. You can recognize when the inner child is seeking validation or rescue from the other partner or the person that you might date. And this unmet childhood need might be disguised as romantic attachment here, as you see that or reflect on that. Now, how you can do that practically? First of all, pause and reflect. Because whenever feelings of obsession or fantasy building arise, take a moment to step back and ask, what has this person I'm seeing or my partner truly done to warrant those strong feelings that I'm having? For example, did the person truly show deep compatibility, or are they simply fulfilling your needs for attention and love? Number 2, name your emotions. Label feelings as they arise, for example, excitement, fear of rejection, and try to link them to a specific behavior rather than broad assumptions about the future. And if you do so, I can definitely guarantee that you already call yourself out and identify if that what you're feeling truly is, stemming from compatibility or is actually coming out of that inner child. And this definitely helps to clarify a lot if that's, as I said, rooted in past trauma or actual reality. Number 3 is to release the idolized role. What you can also do is consciously stopping to assign roles, like what we quite often do as anxiously attached people, the rescuer or the savior, to your partner or the person you're dating. Instead, recognize them as an equal human being with their flaws and limitations. Approach number 3 is shadow work, integrating anxious wounds. Now, what is shadow work? Shortly summarized, it originates also from Carl Gustav Jung's work, and it's an exploration and integration of the unconscious, quite often repressed and hidden parts of ourselves. Often shadow work helps with repressed emotions, with fear and desires, and the goal here is to achieve personal growth for the anxiously attached person. Now, to understand how we can use shadow work as an anxiously attached person, we have to understand that the anxious shadow consists out of repressed fears, unmet needs, and disowned parts of the self, such as neediness, dependency, and fear of abandonment. And these traits often feel shameful or undesirable, leading us to avoid these emotions of projecting them onto others, like people we are dating, for example, or our partners. The purpose of shadow work is for us to uncover, to accept and integrate then those hidden aspects of the self to create, as a consequence, a sense of internal wholeness. And this reduces emotional dysregulation and external dependency for validation. So far, so good, right? But now some practical steps here again. You can also again use your journal to reflect on that and to do some shadow work exercises. You can start by recognizing the disowned parts. This is how you do it. You identify traits or feelings that you reject in yourself, such as when you know that when you have that, I'm too needy. I'm, for example, overly sensitive. Those are the disowned parts. And you can acknowledge that these traits are normal human traits and not flaws. Number 2 is to embrace your emotional needs as well. You can use shadow work to understand that dependency, when balanced, is also natural and a healthy part of relationships as well. So it's not something which is just bad or unfavorable in general. It's also something very normal. Remember that it's the dose that makes the poison. And so it is with shadow work, and so it is with dependency. Shift your perception from shame to self-acceptance by validating your anxious parts' needs for love and reassurance here. Number 3, exploring core beliefs. Shadow work also helps to uncover your unconscious belief, like, for example, I'm not enough, or I'm not perfect and the other person might leave me. The art of doing shadow work, and that's a very cognitive approach here, I have to admit that, is to catch yourself when these beliefs come up and bring yourself back to compassion and understanding. Now, remind yourself that you are great the way you are. Number 4 is then reclaiming personal power. So in this next step, you can also recognize how anxious tendencies like people-pleasing or, for example, over-clinging to other people were also coping mechanisms to maintain connection. And through that shadow work, you get the ability to assert personal power and autonomy without fearing disconnection. And number 5, last but not least, also balancing dependency and independence. Now you can also integrate the shadow by embracing both the need for closeness and the need for personal boundaries in you, and this is the goal here as well. So accept that relationships thrive when both partners are interdependent rather than codependent. And you've heard that right, I didn't say independent, I said interdependent. Both need each other sometimes and both need themselves sometimes. But it's not easy to recognize that because it's not often obvious to identify. Approach number 4, inner anxious parts work. Now in the 4th approach, I like to encourage you to work with your inner parts. And inner parts work, explained real quick, is based on approaches like internal family systems, like IFS therapy. And IFS is shortly summarized a therapeutic model that views the mind as made up of different parts, each with its own roles, feelings, and desires. And there's, for example, a manager, which represents the inner critic. There is the self at its core. That is the central, compassionate, and balanced part of you that you can lead and heal as well. And the goal with IFS and parts work is to build a harmonious relationship between those parts, which then reduces inner conflict and promotes healing. Now, in an anxious attachment, we often deal with unresolved conflicts between inner parts, such as a wounded child, for example, seeking love, and a protector part that fears abandonment. So these parts, for example, are overly active in that scenario. Now some practical steps again. Number 1, what can be extremely enlightening already is to identify the key parts of your anxious attachment style. For example, that there is a wounded inner child here. This part often holds unmet emotional needs such as feeling unloved or unsafe. That there is B, a protector as well, a part that overcompensates through people-pleasing, for example, through excessive reassurance seeking or emotional hypervigilance to prevent rejection. That there is C, an inner critic, a harsh inner voice that blames the self for relational challenges, reinforcing you to feel inadequacy. Now, when you identify those parts, you can, in the second step, build a relationship with each part. So create a compassionate inner dialogue with each part to understand its motivations and fears. Also acknowledge, for example, the protector's efforts to prevent abandonment, even if its strategies are maladaptive. I did this quite often in my second therapy, where I would get in contact with my protector and say, I see that you are protecting me very well. Thanks for doing that work. At the same time, there is no threat around and you can relax. Instead of just creating resistance between you and this inner part, this is a better approach to see that part, to thank that part, and to also acknowledge all the hard work that this part is doing. Another idea is also to reassure the protector that the adult self can manage emotional risk in a relationship now on its own these days. So that the part understands that there is this big, fully grown up adult person now, which is also a true protector and has a lot of strengths. Number 3 is the next big challenge, and that's the inner critic here. So you might recognize the critical voice as an attempt to protect yourself from further rejection or failure. And if you see that and have reflected on that, then you might also reframe self-critical thoughts from, for example, shifting from I'm too needy to I have valid needs that deserve to be met. And maybe you can confirm that these needs rarely have been met in your life. And therefore, number 4, fostering self-leadership. Now, in the first step, it's time to cultivate a self-led approach where the core self, so calm, compassionate, and grounded self, takes charge rather than letting the wounded or protective parts dominate. And because this is essentially the core problem here in the autopilot behaviors that result out of that attachment wounds, this is so critical to understand and to recognize. Self-leadership truly helps you to balance emotional needs and relational boundaries, creating more secure attachment behaviors in your life. And number 5, strengthening your internal security. So by addressing those fears of abandonment and rejection held by the inner child and the protector, your inner part's work builds a stronger sense of internal safety over time this way. And this reduces external dependency on others for validation or emotional regulation as well. And it's definitely very important to understand a long process, so you have to repeat those things over and over again that your unconscious truly understands that. So there is hope for all of us, but there's also a lot of work for all of us. And therefore, let's talk about approach number 5 to work through anxious attachment, which is to establish secure relationship habits. Now, those secure relationship habits for an anxiously attached person can be everything that directly address your anxious attachment patterns. I also like to call these the practical approaches to attachment wounds, basically. It's practicing and healing by exposing yourself to what's triggering you and doing that in baby steps. So the first habit can definitely be to start to communicate your needs. That's very important for the anxiously attached person because anxiously attached people often fear expressing their needs, worrying that they will be rejected as seen as too much, for example. And therefore, many of them become people pleasers, at least as we learned in the early stage of the relationship. We talked about that in the previous episode. And to communicate your needs, you can use I statements, often coupled by the expression of an emotion as well. For example, I feel anxious when you don't text me back, and I need some connection and attention from you now. You can also directly communicate that crystal clear and pretty dry without any manipulation or sabotage here. You also avoid passive-aggressive hints or any other excessive reassurance-seeking behaviors that you might have normally. So you're just saying what you feel and you're just saying what you need. Also, number 2 is to reflect and express emotions. Now, this is also important because anxiously attached individuals often act on emotional triggers without pausing to reflect. And therefore, whenever you felt triggered or dysregulated, pause and name your feelings before you react to them in a conflict or triggering situation. For example, I feel hurt right now, or I feel angry right now, I feel upset right now. Use mindfulness, use conscious awareness and journaling to regulate your emotions before heavy outbreaks. And you can also use our lovely emotion wheel. We have that as a free download in our free workbook, Re-Regulation Resources. It's on the last page, by the way, in the workbook. If you want to download that, just go to understandable.net/book and get a free copy. Let's also talk about boundaries, because setting boundaries is another factor here on that journey. Anxiously attached people also often overextend themselves to gain approval, which leads to dysregulation, resentment, or even burnout in severe cases. And in order to practice this, to communicate better and healthier boundaries, for example, that you need more space, that you need, for example, time to think about something, that you don't have enough capacity for a fight, for discussion right now, then you might practice those, communicating those without feeling too much guilt. And to start to practice those things, setting healthier boundaries, communicating your needs, reflecting and expressing your emotions, I also want to remind you that we have our premium community for exactly that. And in that community, I share everything that I learned while working with different therapists over different years on trauma and attachment wounds. And I put all these things in 30 plus online courses, so a guided step-by-step path that you can also follow and check out for yourself. You can join the platform now at understandable.net/join, get access today. And now I'm curious what you think. What did you do to work through your anxious attachment wounds? Definitely leave me a comment below. And if you want to support the podcast, subscribe to the channel, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And I see you next time for another episode here on the channel. Have a great day.